Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson. We're carrying on from last week, looking at this landscape painting, low-key landscape, so it's got very little contrast. And we're just going to be carrying on in a fairly straightforward manner from the piece that we established in the first session. So this was done pretty quickly, as always, using three colours. So I was using ivory black, ultramarine blue and white, which is giving me ultramarine black as a kind of grey black, and then ivory black is a grey black, and then ultramarine blue is a obviously a higher chroma, kind of mid blue, and then we've got white, which is a grey that lightens. This week it's going to be pretty similar, but we're going to introduce some burnt umber to add some warmth, so we're going to get some warm and cool shifts. We don't want to add too many pigments because part of the reason why this feels like a night scene is that it's not got a great deal of colour contrast. It's got a very strong colour field. It's a very strong blue colour field. But we want the ability to create some shifts between warm and cool in it, particularly in the foreground. But primarily it's going to be sort of cleaning things up a little bit, so working mostly around edges. So I'm fairly happy with the individual sets of values, but some of the edges are a bit looser than I would like them to be, so I want to add some kind of detail in for trees, add a bit more variation in terms of the shifts in the light and the water, and add maybe some slightly lighter values, could push slightly lighter in the top, and just kind of generally shore things up a little bit. So I'm going to start by just mixing up some of my ultramarine blue with some burnt umber. And I want to start just trying out this mixture in the foreground. And then using a slightly smaller brush, I'm just going to create a wash of blacks, almost kind of glazing the black, because as we start to look for detail in this foreground, one thing we're looking for is our most intense blacks, our kind of inkiest blacks are here. So we want to give a little sense of them, because the darker the foreground goes relative to the background, the more that will feel nearer to us. So as well as altering the value slightly, I'm also using my brushwork to add a little bit more detail. And as you get more and more used to working, you want to try to do that. So you want to add, kind of be able to combine steps, so it's a lot more efficient if I can make this both, or alter the value as I want to, but also start adding detail as well. Otherwise I'd have to alter the value, wait for it to dry, add detail, and that's not as efficient. So this becomes a much more efficient use of time. I still don't want to spend ages, so I'm doing it pretty quickly, using quite a lot of medium, so the paint flows. The more medium that you use, the more easily you'll find your paint starts to flow across the canvas. So generally there's the darker shapes, so kind of the larger trees, slightly lower down in this foreground, so they kind of emerge out of the bottom. Also trying to vary my brushwork a bit, so I don't want all of my brush strokes to be moving in the same direction. I'm going to think about how I'm using them, the effect it's going to have. So that's not too bad for those kind of darkest near trees. Maybe just push a tiny bit pure black right into the center of core of those trees where they'd be at their darkest. But yeah, that's not too bad. Starts to already pull this this near ground closer to us. So I go back to that original mix I had, which is a little bit lighter, and I'm going to start patching that in, kind of working slightly back into those darker tree shapes that I just placed. But I also want to work this edge. When I say work the edge, I mean get rid of the kind of more general sort of fuzziness of it and start looking for some slightly more specific stuff going on. That creates more character to the edge, so rather than it being kind of repetitive, kind of smudginess, I can go in and work, say like I'm doing now, some lighter shapes back into the edge. So that gives a sense that there are some gaps between the trees. That light is showing through, or not light, but the reflection of the lake is showing through. So that works quite well. That's probably something I will actually leave to work on more later. Mix back up a slightly darker value. So I'm only going to be using 2 brushes for this. This kind of long, narrow brush and a kind of a flat bristle, kind of mid-length bristle. So I did something bad there. I did kind of 3 dots in a row that was just a little bit too regular. I wasn't looking at the subject enough, and I kind of slipped into sort of automatic painting. When you're doing something from life, you don't want to use automatic painting. You want to use more of your observational skills. So when you start getting too automatic, you start to kind of create kind of patterns. Things become too regular. And it's never as interesting to look at in a painting as a piece that's more considered and built more specifically out of the subject that you're looking at. A little bit better. So that's getting there for that foreground. Fairly happy with it. Maybe want a few more kind of sections where that light starts to kind of show through, but it's something that we're probably going to do a bit of in the last session, so I'm not going to worry too much about it actually. Probably just about leave it at that. So you can see I've now incorporated more darker shapes for some foreground trees. Already starts to give a sense of the trees moving back into the distance, which happens to a much greater degree in this section. That's not too bad. So working up the piece, I'm now going to do a little bit of work using probably largely blue, my ultramarine blue and white, want to start working my transition down from the shadows up there into this kind of clearer, bluer water. So it's quite a delicate balance this, because I don't want to go overboard with the chroma in the blue, the intensity of the blue colour, because it'll start to feel like a bit of an aberration. Some buildings reflected up there, which I can kind of start laying some groundwork for there. That's probably something we'll work on a little bit more next week, that level of detail. So it gives me something to blend into. So now I'm going to get a wad of white, go back to my blue. I need to go a little bit more blue than that. The trickiest thing about this sort of piece is what I'm doing at the moment, which is trying to figure out what balance of chroma you need to build into the piece. So what I've mixed up is actually a pretty good match for what I had down as this colour last week, which makes transitioning up out of it into these new tones I've laid down easier. So I'm trying to get that sort of blurred down that we have going on. So it's starting to work pretty well, those lake reflections. Maybe just bump a few extra little highlights to the brighter sections, kind of working up from the bottom here. Because there's a little bit of a sense of kind of almost wind flicking over the water that I also want to capture. That's not too bad. So that's pretty good for our kind of now mid-ground. Got our darker colour up there, that's not too bad. So we'll skip across to this section up here now. And I'm going to mix a kind of, again, a sort of burnt umber blue for that tone. Because I want to work some warmth into it. I feel like there's a little bit of warmth, even though it's a bit further back and usually that goes a bit bluer. Seems like the right thing to do. Certainly a little bit more in terms of light and dark shifts, sort of in amongst the trees. That will, if I kind of work on that, we'll start to build a better sense of detail in that section. We've got a little building that's there as well. Which we can maybe try to just give a suggestion of. I don't know if that quite works, but I'll leave it in for now. We'll maybe go back and take a look at it next week. I'd maybe say it's going a little bit too far. You maybe don't want to add that much detail at this stage. So go back to our bit more blue in this. That's a bit better. Yeah, I might actually paint that out and we'll work on it next week. Felt mainly like a little bit too much detail relative to what we've got otherwise. I'm going to put the shoreline in because the shoreline will be quite important next week when we start kind of refining even further. The shoreline sort of blends out from a dark edge into this sort of reflected shadowy value. It's not too bad for that reflection, starting to work a little bit better. So again, using quite straightforward brush strokes, just going to add a little bit more variation into these trees, starting to feel like there are more trees there. Gives a bit, kind of adds to the sense of scale. Got some darker trees that come down to the shoreline. Some that sort of almost break it a bit. Yeah, that's not too bad for that section. Can probably just about leave it for today. We're gonna, as I say, we're gonna come back next week and add further detail and start adding those lights in as well. Although might actually do kind of like a detail pass. Maybe add the lights next week and then we'll do a detail pass. So we go back a bit further to that far shoreline. Possibly that's a little bit too dark for the far shoreline. Just lighten it a tad. And that shoreline sort of has this quite blue but paler line that comes up from this set of trees. It sort of runs along behind those buildings. Something like that, so it cuts back into that other land shape that we've got. Oh, a bit too dark that. Just want to kind of soften and separate out that shoreline slightly. Too bad. And then so the final thing I'm going to do today, I've got loads of time left, is work this top edge. So it's going to be blue, pretty blue because it's in the distance, pretty light because it's in the distance. How's that? It's not too bad, pretty good. So again, we're going just a little bit more specific. We're not using as small brush strokes as we were in the foreground because obviously this is further back, so we want less detail. But we do want to add a little bit more variety than what we already have. Fill in these kind of white gaps. And then there's this secondary hill that shifts a bit bluer and a bit lighter again. Come back here, it's not a bad colour for it. Mix a little bit of that into there, this kind of breaks it up nicely. And then finally, what I want to do this week just want to soften that off slightly as well. Not too bad. So finally I'm going to switch back to my big brush, mix up some lighter tones, lighter blue tones. Let's see, how's that? Yeah, it's not too bad. Could maybe go lighter again. Yeah, it's pretty good. Again, we might make one last kind of glaze pass over this. And I just want that to be slightly more separated out than it already was. I'm going to mix an even lighter tone for the sky, something like that's not too bad. I want that to separate out a bit more clearly from the land than it has already. Let's go even brighter yet. Yeah, that's a bit better. And that's pretty much it for today. So again, we worked our way up. We worked progressively. Thought about the big picture while working on smaller sections. And yeah, got it to a pretty good spot. So next week, I think we're going to add in the lights next week, and then the final week we're going to be finishing it off. But it's coming along well. So have a go at that yourself, working from a reference or from life, whichever you prefer. And you can ask any questions in the thread below, or you can always follow through the link and sign up to OCAD. But yeah, that's it for this week, and I'll see you guys soon.